In the frozen darkness of a ninth-century Icelandic winter, a Viking raider named Bjorn makes a choice that defies everything we think we know about medieval survival. He draws his Seek's knife across his forearm. But this isn't combat, this isn't ritual, this is breakfast. The blood drips into barley flour, turning it rust red. Within hours, it will become bread. This is blóðbrauð, blood bread, and for 1,200 years, we dismissed it as myth. Until archaeologists in Greenland found something that changed everything: protein residue in ancient ovens that shouldn't exist. The Vikings weren't speaking in metaphors, they were writing recipes. And the Catholic Church was so horrified they banned it by papal decree. This is the story of how desperation became innovation, how blood became sustenance, and how history's most brutal warriors turned their own bodies into survival rations. In every history class, we learned Vikings were brutal, raiders, pillagers, savages. But what if their most extreme act wasn't violence, it was survival? The blóðbrauð, blood bread, wasn't about conquest. It was about desperation so profound that men chose to bleed themselves rather than watch their families starve. This single recipe forces us to rewrite everything we think we know about Norse brutality. Because this wasn't brutality at all. When famine struck the North Atlantic settlements, Vikings faced a choice: abandon their honor-bound communities or find a solution no one else would dare attempt. The protein in human blood, hemoglobin, contains iron. Mixed with scarce barley flour, it created a survival ration that kept entire settlements alive through winters that killed neighboring villages. Here's what changes everything. This wasn't a one-time desperate act. The sagas describe it as a known technique, passed down with specific instructions. That means Vikings systematically studied human physiology well enough to know how much blood a person could safely give, how to prevent infection, how to rotate donors. They weren't savages. They were pragmatic scientists working at the absolute edge of human survival. When the Catholic Church banned blóðbrauð in 1027, they called it demonic, cannibalistic, an affront to God. But the real reason for the ban: it proved that Norse pagans could survive conditions that would destroy Christian settlements, without prayer, without miracles, using only knowledge and sacrifice. The Church couldn't allow a pagan survival technique to be more effective than faith, so they erased it from history. For 1,000 years, we believed their version. We called Vikings brutal because that's what the victors wrote, until archaeologists in Greenland found those ovens, and the protein residue that shouldn't exist if blóðbrauð was just a myth. The blood bread conspiracy isn't about whether Vikings were violent. It's about how we've confused survival with savagery for 12 centuries. And it's about recognizing that the most brutal thing in Viking history might have actually been their greatest act of community sacrifice. This recipe didn't make them monsters, it made them human. In the frozen margins of 9th century Iceland, survival wasn't poetic, it was brutal. And the sagas, those epic tales we romanticize, hide recipes written in desperation. The word appears only 3 times in surviving texts: blóðbrauð, blood bread. Scholars dismissed it as metaphor for a century. They were wrong. The Eyrbyggja Saga, chapter 17, a winter so harsh that livestock froze standing. The passage describes warriors giving of themselves to the grain. Modern translations softened it to sacrifice, but the Old Norse is explicit: blóð í deigið, blood into the dough. This wasn't ritual. This wasn't symbolism. When famine reached the point of no return, Norse raiders had a choice: die or become the ingredient. Here's what scholars missed for generations. The sagas weren't celebrating this. They were confessing it. The Graga's legal code, Iceland's oldest law book, contains a curious prohibition from 1118. No man shall bake the bread of extremity for another's consumption. The bread of extremity. The law doesn't explain what it is because everyone already knew. You don't legislate against myths. In 2019, linguist Dr. Kara Bjornsdóttir made the connection everyone missed. Blóðbrauð appears in legal codes, not just sagas. It was real enough to ban. The Vatnsdæla saga gives us the recipe, hidden in a passage describing survival craft: barley flour, seawater for salt, and the blood of the baker measured in handfuls. But why blood? The answer is in what these warriors understood that we forgot. Hemoglobin is 13% iron by weight. A single cup of human blood contains more bioavailable iron than 10 pounds of grain. When you're starving, you're not anemic, you're iron depleted and dying. The sagas describe the taste exactly once, as pennies held beneath the tongue and smoke. That's not poetry. That's the metallic tang of heme iron and charred crust. For 1200 years we read these texts as allegory. But the Vikings weren't writing for us. They were writing for survivors who'd already tasted it. The evidence was always there, written in words we chose not to believe, until archaeologists started digging in Greenland and found the ovens. The winter of 862 AD hit Iceland like a hammer. Volcanic ash from Mount Katla choked the sky, killing livestock and burying grain stores under toxic snow. Norse settlements faced a choice: starve, cannibalize their own, or find a source of protein that wouldn't diminish their fighting strength. The solution came from their battlefield physicians. Blood lost in combat could be replaced. Blood given willingly could be measured, controlled. Each warrior could spare approximately 400 milliliters every 8 weeks without losing combat effectiveness, enough to supplement 4 loaves of barley bread. The process became ritualized. At dawn, warriors would form circles, each bleeding into communal vessels, while skalds chanted verses of survival and sacrifice. But here's what historians missed for centuries. This wasn't desperation. It was calculated nutritional science wrapped in warrior culture. Human blood contains 20 grams of protein and 23 milligrams of iron per 100 milliliters. Mixed into bread, it created a survival ration superior to anything available in medieval Scandinavia. The saga of Grettir describes the taste precisely, like licking a blade after battle with smoke from the hearth, copper, salt, and ash. Women were exempt from giving blood. They brewed the herbal teas that prevented infection and managed the fermentation that made the bread digestible. The bread itself was dense, dark red-brown, and baked at low temperatures to prevent the blood proteins from coagulating into inedible lumps. By spring of 863, the practice had spread to Greenland settlements. Archaeology would later find the evidence in the most unexpected place. What began as famine food became identity. Warriors who shared blood bread were bound tighter than those who merely fought together. In 2019, a Danish archaeological team excavating a Norse settlement in Greenland made a discovery that would challenge everything we thought we knew about Viking survival practices. Inside the remains of a communal oven dating to 982 AD, they found dark crystallized residue coating the interior stones, residue that shouldn't have been there. Lead researcher Dr. Christiana Hildersdottir sent samples to 3 independent laboratories. The results were identical: hemoglobin proteins mixed with charred barley grain. But here's what made headlines worldwide. The hemoglobin concentrations suggested not accidental contamination, but deliberate mixing, roughly 1 part blood to 4 parts flour. The dating matched perfectly with known famine periods in Greenland, when supply ships from Iceland failed to arrive for 3 consecutive winters. This wasn't mythology or metaphor. The blóðbrauð was real, and the archaeological evidence was now undeniable. But the Greenland ovens revealed something even more disturbing. Isotope analysis of the hemoglobin showed it came from multiple individuals. This was a communal practice. Further excavation uncovered small iron blades with distinctive wear patterns, consistent with controlled bloodletting, not combat wounds or food preparation. The ovens themselves showed signs of repeated use specifically for this purpose, iron-rich staining in patterns that matched bread baking, not meat cooking. What the scientists found next would connect these Greenland ovens to a network of similar sites across the Norse world, revealing the true scale of this practice. By 1027 AD, rumors of Viking blood bread had reached the marble halls of Rome. What church scribes read in confiscated Norse manuscripts horrified them beyond heresy. Pope John XIX convened an emergency council. The issue wasn't just cannibalistic overtones, it was the theological nightmare of communion. If pagans were consuming bread mixed with human blood as survival ritual, it mocked the Eucharist itself, the body and blood of Christ, profaned by Nordic practicality. The Synod of Pavia issued the decree: any Christian found preparing or consuming blóðbrauð would face immediate excommunication. Death by starvation was preferable to this abomination. But here's what Rome didn't understand. To the Vikings, this wasn't sacred. It was survival mathematics. 1 cup of blood equaled 3 days of strength. 1,200 years later, we're still asking, was the church banning a real practice, or just Viking psychological warfare that succeeded beyond imagination? Missionary reports from Greenland tell us. Father Eirikur's 1032 journal describes finding loaves dark as sin in a raided Norse settlement, still staining the hearthstones. The priest performed an exorcism on the oven itself. He wrote that the stones wept red when heated, as if the devil's bakery remained consecrated to hunger. These weren't metaphors. The protein residue analysis from those same Greenland ovens would eventually prove what Rome feared most. The Vikings actually did it. The ban spread across Christendom. By 1050, even Iceland's converted Norse were forbidden from discussing the old famine recipes under penalty of exile. Yet the sagas survived. Copied in secret, the recipes passed through generations like contraband, not as food instructions, but as evidence of what humans will do to live. The Church's horror crystallized a question we still face. When survival demands the unthinkable, where does necessity end and blasphemy begin? Dr. Helena Kjær's hands trembled as she held the petri dish. The protein sample from the Greenland oven had returned results no one expected. The Norse settlement at Valsey had been abandoned for 600 years, but baked into the stone ovens was a molecular signature that shouldn't exist. Mass spectrometry revealed hemoglobin proteins intermingled with charred barley, not from butchered animals, from human blood. Carbon dating placed the residue between 1015 and 1025 AD, the exact years the sagas described the worst famine in Greenland's history. What archaeologists had dismissed as Viking mythology was now biochemical fact. They had actually done it. But here's where it gets disturbing. The blood concentrations suggested this wasn't a one-time desperate act. It was systematic. 15 different ovens across 3 settlements, all containing the same protein signature, all from the same 5-year period. The Copenhagen team found something else. Trace amounts of iron oxide in concentrations that only occur in dried blood mixed with heat. Dr. Kjær calculated the ratios. To produce 1 loaf, a Viking would need to donate roughly 100 milliliters of blood, just below dangerous levels. They had perfected the recipe. Enough blood for protein and iron, not enough to incapacitate the donor. A grim survival mathematics. The evidence was undeniable, but the academic world wasn't ready to accept that Vikings had been ritual blood bakers. The pushback was immediate. Then they found the teeth. In a mass grave 200 meters from the ovens, 12 skeletons showed identical iron staining patterns. The isotope analysis of their tooth enamel told a story of chronic malnutrition, interrupted by sudden spikes of iron intake. They'd been eating the bread for months. 1 skeleton belonged to a child, no older than 10. Even the young had participated in the blood bread system, whether as donors or consumers. The Catholic Church's 1027 ban suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't about pagan rituals. It was about stopping a practice that actually worked. We set out to uncover the truth behind blóðbrauð, Viking blood bread. What we found instead was a masterclass in how easily fiction masquerades as history. The Icelandic sagas never mentioned blóðbrauð. The 1027 church ban never existed. The Greenland oven residue was never tested for human hemoglobin. Every single pillar of this story, the arm slitting, the iron-rich rations, the penny and smoke flavor, was constructed from whole cloth. But here's what's real. Vikings did face brutal famines. They did practice survival cannibalism in extreme cases. They were pragmatic beyond our modern comprehension. The truth is more complex than the conspiracy, and that's exactly why fabrications like blood bread spread so easily in our hunger for simple, shocking narratives. We want Vikings to be metal album covers brought to life. We want their survival stories to confirm our darkest assumptions about the past. Real archaeological evidence tells a different story. Vikings traded extensively, preserved fish and meat, and rarely faced the kind of isolation that would necessitate such extremes. The blood bread conspiracy reveals more about us than them. Our fascination with transgression, our need to believe in hidden knowledge, our distrust of official narratives. In an age where misinformation spreads faster than fact-checking, blóðbrauð became real through repetition, not evidence. Every university contacted denied involvement. Every cited archaeologist turned out to be fictional. Every source trail led nowhere. Yet thousands believed it because it felt true. Because Vikings should have been desperate enough, brutal enough, practical enough to bake with their own blood. The real conspiracy isn't what Vikings did during famines. It's how easily we abandon critical thinking when a story satisfies our expectations. Human survival reveals itself not in fabricated blood rituals, but in the grinding, unglamorous reality of trade routes, food preservation, and community cooperation. The Vikings survived because they were brilliant logisticians, not because they were the heavy metal barbarians we've invented for entertainment. So here's what blóðbrauð actually teaches us. Check your sources, question viral claims, and remember that the truth rarely tastes like pennies and smoke. The next time you encounter a historical conspiracy that seems too dark, too perfect, too neatly transgressive, ask yourself why you want it to be true. Because in the end, this documentary itself is the conspiracy, a fabrication designed to show you how easily we're all fooled when the story feeds our hunger. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and check out other videos.